Okay, well, welcome. I'm Stephen Silver. As I believe you all know, earlier this year I published my first novel. It's called After Hastings. It's an alternate history set in the year 1067 to 1069 after the Battle of Hastings in England, when in our timeline the Normans came in and conquered England and took over. And in the next hour or so, I'm going to talk about what happened that led up to the actual Norman conquest, why I wrote the book, and then I'm going to do a reading from the book and open it up to questions. Honestly, since we're such a small group, if you do have questions while I'm talking about the background, feel free to put them in the chat, and I can certainly answer them as I go along, assuming that I see them. A little bit of background. I have a master's degree in medieval history. I was studying the period of England I actually focused more in the 12th and 13th century in what I was working on. But the Battle of Hastings is a turning point in English history, akin to the Civil War in the United States history, the American Revolution in the US. And amazingly enough, what I discovered is there's been very little alternate history written based on the Battle of Hastings. And believe me, I've read a lot of alternate history. Back in the mid-90s, I founded the Sidewise Award for Alternate History. So over the years, I've read a lot of alternate history, good, bad, indifferent. And this is one time period that really never shows up for some reason. A couple of people have written about it, sometimes as counterfactual, which is not what we consider alternate history. It's more of playing around with history and seeing what you can do from an academic point of view. And Bob Silverberg seems to have written about the Battle of Hastings in an alternate timeline under a pseudonym, but that's really all that was out there. So it was ground that really was fallow, and I could do whatever I want, and I wasn't really building on or responding to anything anybody else has done with the period. So it was really surprising that nothing had been done with it. Now, going back, we're actually going to start out a couple hundred years before 1066, just to give you a little bit of background about what happened. England was colonized by the Romans and then by the Anglo-Saxons after the Romans left. And the Anglo-Saxons formed several kingdoms, 7 kingdoms traditionally throughout England. And in the 800s, they started to have to fight off Viking attacks. The Vikings were expanding. They were coming down not only to England, but settling in France and Normandy, which of course becomes important, and all the way down to Sicily. They also went over towards Iceland, Greenland, and of course, Vinland, which is now in part of Canada, for a variety of reasons having to do with climate change, which caused them to have a population explosion. They needed more space. The Anglo-Saxons in England, of course, did not really like having the Vikings come down. But the Vikings were coming in, they were taking more and more of their land away. And eventually King Alfred, who's called Alfred the Great and who ruled in the late 800s, managed to find a balance with them. And England was kind of divided, with the Danelaw being the area on the eastern side of England, and that was kind of ruled by the Danes. And Alfred and his descendants ruled over the rest of England, down into Cornwall, up through the Midlands, down into southeast England. And basically they paid Danegeld to the Danes so that they wouldn't continually raid into the English lands. And although that was set up by Alfred, it didn't really stay in place for a long time. The Danes kept trying to raid. They came back every couple of years. More of them came down from Scandinavia. And of course, the English pushed back and pushed back and pushed back, to the extent that by the 950s, about 70 years after Alfred's rule, Alfred's descendants had managed to stop the area of Danish self-rule in England. And they once again claimed sovereignty over all of England, although you had a lot of Danes living and Vikings living in England during this time. As I said, the Danes were not only coming into England, they were also going down into France and Normandy. And around 911, a Viking named Rollo came down from Scandinavia and established himself in Normandy. And his descendants maintained their control over the area and built on it. And at the time, the French kings were very weak, so you could carve out a land, and if you could build it and hold on to it, you could become actually more powerful than the kings, and that's what happened with the Norman Vikings. So Rollo settled there in 911. His descendants continued to live there, and by the early 11th century, about 100 years after Rollo settled there, they were stylizing themselves as the Dukes of Normandy, and they had tremendous power. Now we're going to move back over to England, because here's where things start to get interesting. And laying in the early 11th century, that's when we're laying the groundwork for what happens at Hastings and what you need to know. You can read the book After Hastings, covers right behind me, and enjoy it without this next background. This just adds layers of depth to it, I hope. So in 978, the King of England was a guy named Ethelred, Ethelred II. And Ethelred kind of gets a bad rap in history. He actually lost the English throne for a year of his reign. And traditionally, it's because he's called Ethelred the Unready. If you've heard of him, that's how you've heard of him. That's not what he was actually called. He did have a nickname similar to that, and that was Ethelred Unred. Unred looks like unready. That's, so it morphed into unready because that's the way our eyes see it. But his name was a great pun because Ethel means good or noble. Un means bad or something negative. And red means counsel. So his name could be translated as good counsel, bad counsel. Anyway, so Ethelred ruled over England, and he was dealing with Danish raids. Remember, I said that the Danes were coming back every year raiding England, and that picked up again in the final years of the first millennium. From 997 to around 1001, the Danes were coming down. The Vikings were coming down every year, raiding and going back to Normandy, or to not Normandy, to Norway. And in addition to that, you had Danes living throughout England. They'd been settling there for 200 years at this point. It was, for a lot of them, it was their home. And a lot of those Danes maintained ties back in the old country, but they still viewed England as their home, much like immigrants from Germany, Poland, Ireland, who come to Italy, who come to the United States, have maintained ties back to their homelands after they've settled and made the United States their home. Anyway, around 1001, 1002, word got to Ethelred that the Danish raiders were planning on killing him, and he didn't really take too kindly to that, as you might imagine. So he called out, and on St. Brice's Day in England, which actually is November 13th, so yesterday was the anniversary of it, he called for the execution of all Danes living in England, countrywide. And this would have happened in 1002. It's not known how large the massacre actually was. We know that people were killed. We believe that one of the women killed was the sister of the Danish king, a guy named Sven. In 2008, architectural digging in Oxford found about 40 skeletons that they believe were tied to the St. Brice's Day massacre. And these were going on throughout the country. So we don't know how many Danes were killed, but a lot of Danes were killed, and it pissed off the Danes, especially Sven, who lost his sister, who was living in England. So in 1013, Sven comes down from Denmark with his people, and they invade England. And Ethelred and some of his sons flee to Normandy. Now, Ethelred actually was married twice. This actually does become a little bit important. His first wife was a woman named Elfgeivu, and he had a couple of sons with her. Edmund Ironside was one. Edwig, later called Etheling, was another one. His second wife was a woman named Emma of Normandy, whose brother was one of the Dukes of Normandy. And Ethelred and Emma had two sons. The older one was a guy named Edward. The younger one was named Alfred. And so they flee to Normandy. Back in England, Sven, on Christmas Day of 1013, declares himself King of England. It looks like the Danes have now taken over all of England. They are going to rule it. 5 weeks later, on February 3rd, Sven dies. And Ethelred comes back from Normandy, reclaims his throne, and continues his reign in England. He seems to have left Edward and Alfred, who are quite young. They're like between 11 and between 8 and 11, back in Normandy to be raised by their uncle or their cousin. So Ethelred comes back. He's ruling over England again. A couple years later, in 1016, Sven's son Knut decides that he's going to avenge his father, and he comes down to England, invades the country, and he's pretty successful. He brings the battle to Ethelred. Ethelred fights, is unsuccessful, and actually dies, not in battle, but he just up and dies. And Canute agrees that he will split the kingdom with Ethelred's son Edmund Ironside. Remember, dating back to the Dane law, the English and the Danes have a tradition of splitting the country between themselves. So it's no big deal. Yes, Canute could probably rule over all of England. He decides not to. He's going to share the wealth. This seems like it's all going to work, except for one little problem. And that is that later in 1016, Edmund Ironside also dies. So now Canute is king of all of England. He has a wife, a woman named Elfgivu, not the same Elfgivu who was married to Ethelred. They have a son whose name is Harold. And Canute also marries takes on a second wife. It's not clear if he ever divorced Elfgivu or not, but his second wife is Emma of Normandy, who was married to Ethelred. They also have a son named Hardicanute, who is, of course, Edward and Alfred's half-brother. Okay, so Canute rules England from about 1016 to 1035. He's actually a pretty good king. He's uniting it. He's making very close ties with Scandinavia, which, of course, even when they were fighting the Danes going back 200 years, England looks to the north. They have economic ties to Scandinavia. They have relationship ties, family ties to Scandinavia. The German ties that the Anglo-Saxons have, those date back, into around 500. The more recent ties, though, are to Scandinavia, and so that's where they're looking. They're not really looking to what we consider the continent. They're looking up to the Scandinavian peninsula and Denmark. So Canute rules for several years. He dies in 1035, and his son Harold, by his first wife Elfgivu of Northampton, becomes king. Harold's king for about 5 years. And then when he dies, his half-brother Hardicanute takes over as king of England. Now I'm going to back up just a little bit to give you an idea about what's going on with the English during this time. The English, of course, supported Ethelred at the start. When it became clear that Sven was going to take over England, one of the noblemen, a guy named Godwin, who, he supported Ethelred. When Ethelred died, he gave his support to Edmund, but when it became clear to him that Canute was going to be powerful, he became Canute's man. He was a total kiss-up, total suck-up, and he supported Canute. To the extent that Canute made him the Earl of Wessex in 1018. And over the years, Godwin became one of the most powerful men in England, second really only to Canute. He spread out, he made alliances with other people, and he was extremely powerful. And after Canute died, he maintained that power during the reign of Harold. And in fact, at one point during Harold's reign, about a year into Harold's reign, Ethelred's younger son by Emma, this would be Alfred, decides that he's going to come over to England. And it's not entirely clear why he's coming over. He's coming over with a lot of armed men. There's a good chance that he is trying to regain his father's throne, despite all of his older brothers by both of Ethelred's wives. So he comes over, and it appears that Godwin was involved in a kidnapping of Ethelred that left Ethelred and all of his men dead. After that, Alfred's out of the picture. Harold continues to reign. And in 1042, when he dies, in 1040, when Harold dies, Hardicanute comes to the throne. Hardicanute, of course, is Alfred's half-brother, and he actually did have some relationship with his half-brother, it seems. He liked him. He was still upset about the fact that Godwin led the forces that killed Alfred, and Godwin looked like he was going to be out of favor. It seems, though, that Godwin paid a substantial bribe to Hardicanute, swore allegiance to him, and managed to maintain his position. And 2 years later, Hardicanute died. So now what Godwin, in order to retain his position, he takes a look around and decides that he's going to help put Harold's other son, Edward, back on the throne. Edward's competition for the throne essentially is some of Ethelred's grandsons. But now we have to talk a little bit about how the English passed on the throne. Most of what we've been talking about has been the throne passing down through right of conquest. Canute defeated Ethelred and therefore becomes King of England, and so on. But the English actually had an elected throne. The English barons would meet in what was called the Witenagemot, and the Witenagemot would vote on who they wanted to be king. You could, put forward a variety of claims based on, birth, based on promises made, based on land owned, based on your amount of power. But it really came down to who these noblemen voted on to be the king. And Godwin, through his support behind Edward, and being as powerful as he is, Edward was elected King of England, and he would rule from 1042 to 1066. That does not mean that things were clear sailing for Godwin. Edward did not trust Godwin. Why did Edward not trust Godwin? Because he was an intelligent man, and Godwin had proved pretty much untrustworthy. And long about, it was a matter of keep your enemies, your friends close, but your enemies closer. In 1045, when he had been on the throne for 3 years, Godwin arranged an alliance and a marriage between Edward and his daughter Edith. The two of them married, but it is believed that they never consummated the marriage, that they agreed to live in what's, as in the way it was termed at the time was as brother and sister. And so, of course, Edward never had any kids. He was, he came to be known as a very holy man. He's known as Edward the Confessor. He was sainted after his death. So that was in 1045. A few years go by, and Godwin and his sons are getting to be too powerful. Godwin has about 6 or 7 sons. They're getting to be too powerful, and they wind up having to go into exile into Ireland, which they do in 1051. It doesn't last very long. They manage to come back, work their way back into Edward's reasonable graces, and return to England. When Godwin dies in 1053, his son Harold is made Earl of Wessex. His other sons are also given various earldoms around England. So this kind of gives you an idea about what's going on politically in England in the decade and about up to a decade and a half before the Battle of Hastings. During his reign, though, Edward may have made a promise to his cousin, William of Normandy, who eventually becomes Duke, promising William that when he dies, William can become King of England. It's okay for Edward to make this promise, but with Witenagemot, it doesn't actually mean anything. The barons have to elect him no matter what. And frankly, there's reason to believe that if you make this promise, the barons are going to follow it. Frequently it's been done in the past, although usually the person making the promise has the support of the nobleman when they make the promise. It doesn't always happen that way. Hardicanute actually seems to have promised the throne of England after his death to Magnus, who is the King of Norway. And the weird thing about this is the promise seems to have occurred in 1038 when Hardicanute's brother Harold was still King of England. It was actually more of a wide-ranging promise than just, when I die, you can be the king. It was more of a, if I die before you, you can have everything I own, and if you die before me, I get everything you own. In any event, when Hardicanute died in 1042, it didn't go to Magnus, it wound up going to Edward. Again, this may become a little bit important later on. So Edward is promised the throne to William. Okay, great. Things go on. In 1064, Harold is shipwrecked. We don't know exactly why he was on the ship. He may have just been fishing off the coast of England, got caught up in a storm. He might have been going on a diplomatic mission to the continent. In any event, he's shipwrecked in 1064 off the coast at a place called Ponthieu. And he's rescued, taken captive, given succor by Count Guy of Ponthieu, who happens to have his liege, William of Normandy. So Guy actually turns Harold over to William, and William forces Harold to promise to support his claim to the English throne when Edward eventually dies, which Harold does because it's the best way to get home, quite honestly. Yes, he's making a promise. Yes, Harold can point to that promise. But of course, a promise made under duress or coerced is not really worthwhile, generally, unless you have the force to make it worthwhile. So that's where the situation is at the end of 1065. At the beginning of 1066, Edward dies. And Harold Godwin claims the throne of England and is elected to it by the Wheaton Angemo, most of whose members are his relatives. The news spreads out, and it's not greeted well on the continent. You have at least two other people who are claiming that they have a right to the English throne. One of them, of course, is William in Normandy, who claims that he has the right to the English throne because Edward promised it to him and Harold swore an oath to support it. He is also William's first cousin once removed, which quite honestly, I have to sit down with the family tree, may actually mean that he's next, would be his heir. Coming down from coming down from Norway, you have the King of Norway, Harald Hardrada, whose father Magnus was promised the English throne by Hardicanute back in 1038, and who had visions of building a massive Norse empire. He had fought battles in Russia, what we now consider to be Russia. He has claimed land there. He tried to reclaim Denmark for Norway unsuccessfully. He may have actually looked out towards Iceland, but now he looked to England. And also playing into that was the fact that Tostig, who is one of those brothers of Harold that we mentioned, whose father was Godwin, has had his earldom of Northumbria removed from him by his brother Harold. He's pissed off. He's looking for revenge. He reaches out to Harald Hardrada and says, if you want to invade, I will support your claims. There's actually a fourth claimant to the throne beyond Harold Hardrada, and William. And this is a guy named Edgar Etheling. He's the last surviving member of the House of Cerdic, who has reigned England for several hundred years. His grandfather was Edmund Ironside. He's the great-grandson of Ethelred Unred. And he also happens to be the great half-nephew of Edward the Confessor. So again, he has a claim by blood. He's also living in Hungary and doesn't really pay much attention to, seem to be paying much attention to what's going on in England. He has a life for himself. So what happens is William is amassing forces in Normandy. Harald Hardrada is amassing forces in Norway. They're both looking to come down to invade England, whether it's to take it all for themselves or whether they're planning on going to split it up. They're not working together at all. The way the English army worked at the time was the King of England had the right to call up men-at-arms from his various barons, but only for a limited period of time. Because remember, these are not warriors, they're not trained fighters. It's not like something out of Dungeons and Dragons. These are farmers. These are farmers who are trained to use a bow, they're trained to use possibly a sword or a spear. They also are using their farm implements as weapons. But their primary goal is to work the fields. So they can only be called up for a certain number of days a year. And so Harold calls them up. He thinks that the invasion is going to be coming from Normandy. They're in the south. They have all these men. and there's bad weather down south, and William cannot sail from Normandy to England. So now it looks like the invasion is going to come from the north. Harold and his men rush to the north. He loses men the entire time because they're dropping off to stay behind to do their farming. He's picking up new men. This is in the beginning of September. Gets up to Northumbria, where Tostig and Harold have already landed. They've already fought a battle with another set of brothers, Edwin and Morcar. They defeated Edwin and Morcar, and they finally meet up with Harold at a place called Stamford Bridge in the middle of September, actually towards the end of September. Harold defeats them, kills both of them, kills Tostig, kills Hardrada, and around the time of that battle, the winds change down south. William and his men are able to come over from Normandy to invade at Hastings. As he comes back south, Harold is again losing a lot of his army because they're staying in their homelands, they're going back to their fields. He's trying to pick up more people. When they get down to Hastings, they eventually meet in battle on October 14th in 1066. The battle actually starts out going in the favor of the English. It seems, based on some recent evidence that we've uncovered, Harold was a much better tactician and strategician than William. He was more experienced. He had a better position on the field. They were higher up. And it seemed like they could win the battle. In addition, during the middle of the battle, the rumor starts to spread that William has been killed. And William's forces break. They start to flee, especially a group of Breton mercenaries that he brought over with him. They also are fleeing. If their paymaster's gone, there's no reason to fight for him. The English pursue them. William, who has not actually been killed, pulls off his helmet. He had bright red hair. People could see that. They could see he was still alive. His forces managed to rally. They took the battle back to the English, and it's believed that Harold was killed with an arrow to the eye. There are a couple of legends surrounding his death. One of them is that, yes, he was found dead on the battlefield, and his mistress, a woman named Edith Svanhaus, was brought in to identify him. There are other myths that he survived the battle and lived off as a hermit and lived to the end of his days that way. Didn't happen. Anyway, so William has won. He proclaims himself King of England on Christmas Day, and then spends the next several years strengthening his realm. The important thing about this happening is, remember I said that England was looking to the north. They were looking to Scandinavia for trade, for the family ties, for everything else. Now, with William in charge, William doesn't view England as my kingdom. He views it as this place that I conquered so that I can take the money that I can raise there to help pay for my duchy back over in Normandy, which is the really important thing. But it means that now, in the space of a day, essentially, England has turned from being part of the North to being part of what we consider Western Europe. And for the next 1,000 years, England will be tied to Western Europe, to France, to Germany, Italy, Spain, and so on, because of the Battle of Normandy. So that's really one of the important things there. So having said all that, before I go into the reading, let me open it up to a few questions. I actually do see one. So Evan asks that he didn't realize that they used to vote for kings in England and wants to know when they adopted the patrilineal system that's used now. As I said, there was a certain amount of patrilinealness in their vote. It wasn't wide open. It wasn't a general election. But you needed, to have power in order to gain power. You needed to have the support of your noblemen. Once William comes in, the Witenagemot is completely gone, and it is strictly, well, not strictly patrilineal, because of course, William, when he died, he had 3 surviving sons. He had Robert Curthose, he had William Rufus, and he had Henry. And the way it divided up was Henry got Bubcus, William Rufus was given England, which was viewed as a consolation prize. He was the second son. And Robert Curthose became the new Duke of Normandy, which was considered to be the big prize. Robert and William didn't really get along. They fought several battles trying to consolidate what was their father's kingdom. and duchy. William was killed by an arrow to the head on a hunting trip in the New Forest. Robert was essentially imprisoned for his entire life, and Henry swooped in and took over both Normandy and England, ruling for about 35 years, if I recall correctly, from 1100 to 1135. So hope that answers your question. Does anybody else have any other questions before I start reading the first chapter of the book? Just post them in the chat if you want. Okay, that being said, let's read. Now, I will be honest, one of the pieces of feedback I've gotten on the novel is I've had people say, I don't explain where the point of change is. And that was actually very intentional. I didn't want to, because generally people don't talk that way in real life. And I wanted to make this a very, very realistic novel, or as realistic as I could. So it opens up with an epigram at the beginning of the first chapter. This is taken from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was maintained by monks at the time. They were basically writing the news. The change happens halfway through this paragraph. There's a line about Earl William's Bretons turning against their master. As I just said, told you, that actually happened, but when William proved that he was still alive, they fought for him again. In my timeline, they don't. They turn against William, and it turns the battle in favor of the Anglo-Saxons. So that's actually the exact moment, you'll hear in a second, of where this all changes. So, 1066. Then came William, Earl of Normandy, into Pevensey on Michaelmas Eve, and as soon as they were prepared, they built a stronghold at the town of Hastings. This was made known to King Harold. He gathered a great army and came against them at the ancient apple tree. William came upon them unawares before they had gathered. The king nevertheless fought very hard with those men who would stay with him, and they were many killed on both sides. The king put the invaders to rout, slaying many thousands of Franks. Earl William's Bretons turned against their master and helped the king when they saw the battle turn. Although Earl William escaped the field, he was sorely defeated, and many of his men lay now in 6 feet of English arable. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Chapter 1. Cold January winds whipped around the palace at Winchester, howling as they moved over and through holes and crevices in the massive structure. Inside, Harold relaxed in front of a blazing fire, listened to the otherworldly howls, and breathed a sigh of relief. He was finally putting his realm back into order after the invasions of the previous year. Hardrada lay under 6 feet of English soil, the only land he was able to claim after his raid in the north. William the Bastard sat at his capital, Rouen, too weakened after his defeat at Hastings to pose any sort of threat to England for many years to come. Harold had already replaced the earls who had been killed at Stamford and Hastings with his own men. Following his reconciliation with his final continental enemy, Harold and England could look forward to a time of peace, which would be reminiscent of the reign of Canute in the early years of the century. A knock on the door interrupted Harold's thoughts. The king put down his goblet of mead on the table next to his chair and glanced at his friend Ethelwine. Ethelwine motioned for a slave to open the door and shifted his leg closer to the fire. He had suffered a leg wound at Hastings, and although it had healed properly, the cold weather tended to exacerbate his condition. The slave opened the door to reveal one of the palace pages. The young boy, it took Harold a few moments to come up with the name Edwin, bowed quite quickly to the king and Ethelwine before he entered the room, when Harold nodded in his direction. The papal legate Hildebrand has arrived at Winchester and requests an audience with you at your earliest convenience. Already? Damn, he made good time from Dover. Harold scowled at Ethelwine before turning back to the messenger. Has His Holiness finally agreed to recognize my right to rule the English? Harold asked, perhaps a bit too sharply. The page showed no reaction to the king's surliness. By now, most of the king's entourage knew that Harold had no love for the Pope, who, 3 months after William was soundly defeated, still refused to drop his backing of the Frenchman. I could not say. The legate merely sent a message saying he was here and requested an audience with you. Harold turned to Ethelwine, who had returned to his seat across the table from the king. Do we wish to have the papal legate interrupt our evening of relaxation? I would imagine that this Hildebrand would wish to rest himself after the long journey from Rome. I hardly want to have some foreigner yammering at me in Italian or Latin or whatever tonight. As Ethelwine finished speaking, the eerie howl of the wind dropped abruptly to punctuate his sentence with a sudden silence. Edwin looked towards the room's windows and quickly crossed himself. Harold simply ignored the lack of wind and continued, filling the silence with his voice. Ethelwine, my friend, you have a good point. We've been relaxing here this evening. All Hildebrand is likely to do is take up some of our time to tell us that His Holiness has come to his senses and wishes to recognize my right to be the king of the land which elected me and which I defended from not one, but 2 invasions. Since he will hardly be in an antagonistic mood, there's no reason we should hurry to see him. Harold turned to face the young page. Tell the legate that we hope he had a safe and swift journey and that we wish him a comfortable and relaxing stay in England. Extend my invitation to Hildebrand to attend my anniversary banquet tomorrow. He can help us revel and at the same time keep his priestly eye on us to make sure we don't overindulge and go against the precepts of the church. Harold's chuckle held just a touch of scorn. After you deliver this message to the legate, find my brother and have him join us. Edwin quickly bowed his head to Harold and slipped out the door, carefully closing the stout portal behind him. As the iron latch fell into place, the slave lifted a pitcher to refill the king's now empty goblet. The 2 men sipped at their drinks in silence for a few minutes as the howl of the wind picked up once again. Finally, Harold stood up and walked to the window. The wind blew his long hair around his face as it created knots Harold knew would be painful to force out. The cold air caused the king to shiver, but it was also invigorating, and Harold stood by the window for a few more minutes before walking over to the fireplace. Cold and hot formed a nice contrast, he thought, as he warmed his hands and arms. Turning his back to the fire, he faced Ethelwine, Harold's face betraying only business. What do we know about this Hildebrand? Well, he's a trusted counselor to Pope Alexander. In some unclear way, Hildebrand was instrumental in Alexander's election. I also understand that he's reform-minded and views the church in England and the empire as being horribly corrupt. I've heard rumors that he disagreed with Alexander when the Pope sent the papal banner to William when the bastard rode against us last October, but I'm not entirely convinced of that. At the mention of William's name, Harold felt his blood begin to rise. The Frenchman believed that 2 promises made to him, one by Edward and one by Harold himself, although under duress, constituted a rightful claim to the throne of England, despite that the Nangimo, the elective council, declared in favor of Harold. William, however, had dropped his claim, something the Pope had refused to do. Harold calmed himself. With the Pope's acquiescence, all Harold's foreign enemies will have accepted his claim to the English throne. Assuming we are correct and the Pope has finally agreed to recognize us, how far do you think we'll be able to push Hildebrand? Oh, I didn't say he was favorable to you, merely that I had heard he disagreed with Alexander over sending the papal banner to William, not about William's right to rule England. From everything I've heard, Hildebrand is canny and won't be willing to give you anything he can avoid. Will I be able to threaten Hildebrand into making concessions? What I know of the man is only through hearsay. I don't think so. Alexander hasn't had a rival since Honorius was anathematized 2 years ago. Even the Germans dropped him after 1065. If you threaten to support him instead of Alexander, the only company you'll have is the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I hardly think Hildebrand will take that threat seriously enough to make a few small concessions. Harold nodded. You're right. I suppose the Pope's recognition will be enough to content me this 12th night. As Harold and Ethelwine took drinks from their goblets, a sharp rapping on the door cut through the whistling howl of the wind. The slave opened the door to reveal Leofwine, Harold's brother. Leofwine was a tall man for a Saxon and let his hair grow long in the back. His chin was beardless in the style currently worn by the English, but he sported a neatly trimmed mustache over his lip. His dark blue eyes tended to draw the attention of everyone, no matter where he went. Leofwine took long strides across the room to help himself to some mead, and pulled a chair close to the fire. He dropped into the chair, took a long drink of the mead, turned to his brother. Despite sitting by the fire, Leofwine retained the cloak he wore over his regular clothing. Damn this cold weather. It's bad enough with the cold and damp in the spring and autumn, but these English winters are made by the devil himself. Unlike Harold, who loved the cold and damp of the kingdom, Leofwine longed for the warmth which never came to England. Already the 2 brothers had discussed the possibility of Leofwine making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem once Harold was secure on his throne, possibly even stopping to visit the Pope in Italy as Harold's representative. Harold knew that Leofwine was already making plans to leave in the late spring. Although Leofwine had little, if any, call for religion, Harold knew his brother saw the pilgrimage as a means of escaping England's harsh environment for the warmer, drier climates of the Holy Land. Come, my brother, your blood is just thin. Although they hadn't been particularly close before Harold became king, they had learned to be friends in the aftermath of Hastings. At one time, they had only been 2 among 6 brothers. Now 3 of their brothers lay dead, and Wulfnoth, the remaining youngest brother, was either dead or a prisoner of William of Normandy. Their ability to joke together had not come easily, but now that they had found it, they both relished having a surviving and loyal brother. My blood may be thin, but at least it's all still inside my body. To surviving. Leofwine raised his goblet and emptied the golden mead into his throat. Instead of rising from his chair, Leofwine hooked his foot around the leg of the table, dragged it across to where he sat by the fire. When it was almost in his reach, Harold leapt up from his chair, grabbed the pitcher of mead from the tabletop to refill his own and Ethelwine's goblets. From the heft of the pitcher when Harold handed it to Leofwine, the Earl could tell he was left only with the dregs. Boy! Leofwine's deep bass voice drowned out the howl of the wind, and the slave jumped to his side. Fetch us more mead. The boy hurried from the room. Leofwine allowed a small smile to form on his mouth before he turned to Harold. Now, what's so important you had to drag me away from my comfortable fire so I could be blessed by your comfortable fire? Ethelwine's here, so it isn't just lack of company. Harold walked back to where Leofwine sat and handed his brother his own goblet. We've received word that the papal legate Hildebrand has arrived at Winchester this evening. Already? He only landed at Dover a few days ago. He must have had fast horses, and even then he couldn't have dawdled. How he did it is immaterial. The point is he is here already. I've sent word that he shall attend tomorrow's celebration. That will certainly put a feather in your anniversary, having the Pope himself recognize you as king, as he should have done last Epiphany. Leofwine's smile suddenly flagged. Who else knows Hildebrand's here? Well, as far as I know, just the 3 of us. Hildebrand, his retinue. Any of the servants who have taken over the, who have taken care of the legate's baggage, the townspeople who are billeting the group, anyone the servants have gossiped with, anyone else in Winchester, I imagine. Leofwine, this isn't exactly the sort of thing we can keep secret. No, I suppose not, but I would prefer not to advertise anything until the legate has announced the Pope's recognition. Ethelwine spoke for the first time since Leofwine had entered the room. Perhaps we can arrange for Hildebrand to be put in some empty apartments here in the castle. Although everyone will know they're here, they won't be parading around Winchester to remind everyone of the fact. An excellent suggestion. Leofwine banged his goblet down on the table, splashing mead across the tabletop as well as his arm. At the same time as it keeps Hildebrand from the public eye, it will demonstrate the proper honor to the legate and the Pope. Harold said, "See that it is done." Leofwine walked to the door and opened it to find the slave standing in front of it with a large pitcher of mead. While the slave placed the pitcher on the table, Harold bellowed for Edwin to get his steward. When the man arrived, Harold told him to find Hildebrand a place within the castle and arranged to move the legate and his entourage into the keep immediately. Turning back to his brother and Ethelwine, Harold raised the pitcher in a toast. And now to finalize tomorrow's celebrations. So thank you. Now, if you have any questions, you can either type them in the chat box or you can unmute yourself and ask away. And I hope you enjoyed the little history lesson and the first chapter. We have about 3 minutes left. So. Unmute yourself anyway, just so that I feel like I'm not sitting in a room all by myself.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, Steve.
Hi.
Stephen.
So I hope you enjoyed it. If you are interested, I'm going to put a URL in the chat. This has a lot of history about the book. A lot of what I just shared with you. It has some pieces about why I wrote it the way I did, and of course it has links so that if you need to buy the book, and I personally think it would be a good book to buy, you can click through, buy it from Amazon on either in paper or in electronic versions. It's available in Mobi and EPUB, PDF, Word, whatever you want it in.
All right, boy, and thanks for the history lesson.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm glad you enjoyed it. So thank you all.
Thank you.
I can say I read the book and I highly recommend it. I read it in just a few days. It's an excellent book.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Taking this. Okay.
That was me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Carrie actually read part of it about 20 years ago. She read the opening chapter a long time ago, so she's been waiting for this a long time.
And so did Joan Vinci.
Yes, Joan and Jim Franco read it. I think Jody Lynn Nye also read part of it. So, So I'm glad that it lived up to your weight. And Evan, frankly, it might be right up your alley. As you may have gathered from that first chapter, there is a lot of religion in this book. It actually is almost more an alternate history of religion than of the kingdom.
Oh, wow.
Interesting.
I already have the book purchased, actually. I'm just waiting for time to read it. So
Okay. Well, read it, and I promise if you have it in hard copy, I will sign it for you when I see you next. Actually, one of the other things is I do have a chapbook that I will be carrying around with me at various live conventions when those happen. That if you want it, it gives you a lot of the background, a lot of the history. It's a little companion about 20 pages long. So if you do have it electronically and are interested in that, I would be more than happy to sell you a copy for like $2 and sign that so that you can get my signature on something. So,
Thank you. Very kind.
so, okay, well, thank you all, and I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
all.
Bye.
Good seeing you.